Okay, welcome back, advanced procrastinators. We are reviewing chapter 16 on World War II today. So, as you guys know, hopefully you guys have already answered these study guide questions, and we'll be reviewing those in the lecture today. And you'll be answering these checking for understanding questions as well in the Google doc that was attached to your Canvas assignment. So let's talk about Hitler, right? And his rise to power. Now, how was Hitler able to convince Germans to support his National Socialist Party, which is the epitome of evil to a lot of people? Well, number one is he created a cult of personality, right? Hitler basically convinced the German people that he alone could fix Germany's problems as a larger than life figure. This is a lot of technique that a lot of demagogues use in order to get their power, that only they alone can do that. And in a lot of ways, Hitler was successful in turning the country around for the positive until the war ended. Also, he used war guilt. He convinced Germans, right, that the Treaty of Versailles, which was the cause of a lot of problems for Germans, right, were the result of poor leadership in the country and the Jewish population as well, too. So he was finding a scapegoat for the problems that people were facing. Now, a simple question and answer is, why did Hitler want to target the Jews? Because they are the ones that suffer incredible amounts of punishment for what his beliefs were. The answer is, why punish the Jews is basically the Jews, as an educated group, historically an educated group, right, have always been able to use their education in order to do well in business, right? So they were a group that had a large sway of the economy that they control. They were the bankers, right, in a moment when a lot of people were losing their money, and they were owners of a lot of factories as well, too. And the German economy was essentially in ruins, but they were still being able to make money. So he was able to make it look like the Jews, or the one percenters, who were responsible for all the problems in Germany. Now, neutrality or isolation. A lot of Americans wanted to stay out of the war or the fascist aggressions that were happening around the war for several reasons, right? And what America passed was an act in the 1930s called the Neutrality Act, which is designed to keep Americans out of war. It basically said that Americans cannot sell goods to nations at war, right? This is to try to prevent war by saying, hey, you can't fight a war if you can't get guns. So we're not going to support you having more guns to fight more war. Also, we can't loan money to countries at war. A lot of people said this was the reason why America really got into World War I, is we loaned money to France and England, and the only way to get our money back was for France and England to win. So we had to help them win the war. Okay. Now, what ended up happening is these neutrality acts, which were meant to prevent war, actually ended up helping Hitler and other fascist nations. And how did that help them? Well, the answer was this, right? Is it prevented the US from helping nations at war. And what Germany and Italy were doing is they were attacking nations, right? So when they would attack a weaker nation, we could not help the weaker nation against the German or Italian attack. And a good example of that is the Spanish Civil War in 1936 to 1939. Francisco Franco was a fascist who came to power in the 1930s, right? And Spain had a civil war between the fascist forces and the Republican forces. And from this war, you get two of the most iconic images about the destruction of war. You can see above, there's the soldier being shot. At the moment he's being shot, he's a Republican soldier. And that's Picasso's Guernica image of the atrocities that happened in Guernica, Spain. Right. So we were prevented from helping Republican forces, whereas the fascist forces were able to use the Spanish Civil War as kind of like a spring training, where Germany was able to test all their weapons and their tanks and their fighting techniques that helped them become more prepared for World War II. Now, before the war begins, I want you to identify an area that Germany and Italy invaded before World War II started, and think, why didn't the world do more to try to stop them? And Germany is going to invade Czechoslovakia, which is right here, before World War II begins. Now, the reason why he invaded Czechoslovakia, or why Hitler was able to invade Czechoslovakia, was it was a moment called appeasement. There's an area in Czechoslovakia right here called the Sudetenland, right? And this was an area that used to be part of Germany that had a German speaking population, and Hitler basically threatened to invade the Sudetenland unless he had access to this, right? Now, England and France appeased Hitler by saying, you can have the Sudetenland. In return, Hitler promised not to take any more land. Now, obviously, Hitler lied. He took over Sudetenland, and shortly later, he took over all of Czechoslovakia. So he's now been able to expand Germany from not just the Rhineland. He's also occupied Austria, which is a German-speaking country, but not part of Germany. Hitler's actually an Austrian. Right. And now he's put Czechoslovakia in there as well, too. And knowing what we know about them, why did people even entertain the fact, like when Hitler said, I promise not to take any more countries, okay, Hitler, thank you. And the answer to that is basically Europe is in an economic depression just like the United States is, right? And so far, all Hitler has done is taken back the Rhineland and Austria and the Sudetenland. These are all German areas, right? That used to be kind of part of Germany, and were taken away as a result of the League of Nations. And also, Hitler's not seen as a bad guy yet. The bad guy is actually Stalin, right, over here in Germany, who's threatening to spread communism. Now, for the Italians, what they did is they invaded Ethiopia. The Italians were still upset at the fact that when World War I ended, they weren't given any territories, especially in Africa. And Ethiopia was an area that Italy tried to invade in the late 1800s and they failed, so they went back in there again. Now, the world response when Italy invaded Ethiopia was Haile Selassie went to the League of Nations and begged the world for help, to beg the world to come to their aid and provide weapons, right? The problem was one, America had the Neutrality Act, and we said we're not going to give guns to people at war. So the Italians, who were gearing up for war as part of the rearmament method to bring their economies around by putting lots of the country's money into building weapons, Italy was prepared for war. The Ethiopians were not, right? So the world wasn't ready to stand up, because we were in a depression as well too, and Italy and Germany used the depression or government aid to build their militaries, and you had the Ethiopians fighting with ancient single shot rifles versus and on horses versus the Italians in tanks with machine guns. Now, AP tip. What is fascism and what is communism, and how are they different or how are they similar in some ways? Because there are similarities when you think of like both Hitler and Stalin. They are both evil figures of the 20th century, but in this war they end up fighting against each other, right? And communism and fascism are not the same. So here's what they basically are. Over here is fascism, right? And the idea of fascism is that it is making individuals loyal to the nation as a whole, as a team. We'll give up our rights in order for the team to do well. And the idea here is to make Germany, make the country great again. Whereas communism says no, individuals are loyal to their working class. Okay. The poor are always being messed over by the rich. So, what's going to happen with communism is the poor, the workers around the world will rise up, overthrow the rich, and then the workers will all share in their rewards, right? So it's creating a workers' paradise. Now, what both Hitler and Stalin had in common is they were both totalitarians, right? Which basically means the leader has complete control of the nation and demands obedience, right? And basically, it is creating this image of these two characters as godly like figures. In fact, communism does not believe in religion because the idea of communism is you do not want people to follow the rules of a god. You want people to follow the rules of the state, right? Now, the point here is why do you think people supported? Because people did. The people of Russia had a revolution and they did bring in communism, and the people in Germany did elect Hitler and they did support what he was doing. Why did people support these ideologies that actually took away people's rights? And the answer is, right, is that both countries, Russia in the early 1900s and Germany in the 1930s, were incredibly broke. And in bad times, people are looking for ideas and leadership, even in the United States, guys, right? We elected FDR because he had a new idea, the New Deal, and he was a leader that Americans believed in. And FDR took America the closest it's ever been to socialism, right? It's definitely far away from laissez-faire, right? And Stalin and Hitler, they're promising jobs and security, right? And a lot of people when they're starving are like, look, freedom can't feed me. I need a job now and I need to get fed. So please get me a job. And they provided those jobs to people. Now, on the other side of the world, you have Japan and its aggression because Japan wants to become a world power in the Pacific and in Asia, right? And the area that China is going to invade is going to be Manchuria up here, and they rename it Manchukuo because Japan isn't being an island needs access to natural resources, right? So Japan in the early 30s, right, invades Manchuria and basically violates the open door policy where all countries have equal access to China. So the Stimson Doctrine, basically, the U.S. refuses to recognize Japan's occupation, right? Now, this is really a major half step in protecting the sovereignty of China, right? I mean, Japan invades and we say, bad Japan, go away, don't do that, right? Whereas when the Boxer Rebellion happened in 1900, Americans invaded China with other national forces and was able to put down the rebellion, right? How come America only took half steps here, right? When Japan later goes into a full scale war against China in 1937? Well, the reason is we are also in the midst of a Great Depression, and we were in no state to support the Chinese with aid, right? And don't forget, once again, that Neutrality Act is preventing America from aiding countries at war in an effort to keep us isolated. So we were not really able to give China the aid what was necessary to stand up to the Japanese, who also use militarism and building up their military as a way to get themselves out of their own economic depression and prepare for this war. Now, what's going to change to allow America to get involved in the war is going to be, without fighting, is going to be the Lend-Lease Act, right? And this negates the Neutrality Act. After the Neutrality Act, there's something called cash and carry, where America says, yes, we will sell you arms if you have cash. Right, that was an effort to help England. But what ended up in England is England's like, look, we don't have any money anymore. So can you help us fight against the Nazis? Because England, after Hitler had taken over all of Europe, England or the United Kingdom was the last country fighting against Hitler. So basically, this said that the U.S. could help any country threatened by fascist aggression, right, with military and financial assistance short of actually going to war. Now, Hitler actually saw America as already having been in the war with all the aid the United States provided, right? And the point here is how did Roosevelt justify the Lend-Lease Act? That's basically putting America on a war footing without actually fighting, and it is upsetting Hitler, right, to the point where Hitler was going to use his navy to start attacking American ships. Well, the way FDR worded this is he said, what America stands for is up here, these four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, right? And these are the freedoms that every person in the world should enjoy. And during the beginning of this war, right, obviously in Poland, obviously if you're Jewish, obviously you're Chinese, right, these freedoms were not being practiced by those people. People were in fear of living every single day, and people were starving every single day, besides the fact that these totalitarian governments limited speech and freedom. Okay. Now, that for freedoms goes even further, right, with the Atlantic Charter, which is a moment when basically Churchill from the UK and Roosevelt from the USA, they meet in Newfoundland with the idea that America is not yet in this war, but America will soon be in this war. Pearl Harbor hasn't happened yet, right? And basically, it stated that the Atlantic Charter stated that the Allies, England and the United States, right, are going to stand up for what we're going to fight for. And we're going to fight for the four basic freedoms. And when this war is over, we are not going to seek any territorial expansion. So, number one, it's addressing the mistakes of World War I, where people were essentially fighting for imperialism, take over more land in Africa. But it's also meant to differentiate the Allies from the actions of the Axis powers. Germany, Italy, and Japan are literally fighting to create an empire, right? Japan's taken over China, Southeast Asia, and much of the Pacific, and Germany's taken over all of mainland Europe, you know. So it's not just fighting over Africa. So we're trying to say, look, we are fighting a war for liberation. So please, countries of the world, when you're making your decision of what side you want to be in this war, you want to be on the side of freedom. We're basically trying to establish ourselves as the good guys in this war. Of course, the United States at home did not always live up to the ideals we profess, where we're fighting for the freedom of all people. And one way was when the war breaks out, we had segregation in the military. African American soldiers were not allowed to fight alongside whites, even though Mexicans could, Germans could, Italians could, you know, actually the Japanese, they fought for America too, but they were not allowed to fight alongside whites as well too. But African Americans were definitely segregated and were not allowed to fight until the very end of the war. And what you had, A. Philip Randolph created something called the Double V campaign, right? The two V's are victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. And the importance of this Double V campaign is that the federal government in its hiring practice became less discriminatory and started hiring more African Americans into government jobs. It's one of the first steps of trying to create some kind of job equality for all races in the United States, right? Obviously, the most glaring violation of America not living up to our rights is the internment of the Japanese, which was an executive order 9066. It is FDR who signed with a pen the arrest of 125,000 Japanese Americans, right? And keep this in mind, these Japanese Americans, right? 2/3 of them were native born Americans, right? They were not immigrant Japanese Americans. They were people that went to local high schools, right? And they were forced to sell everything they had. They were then arrested and housed in concentration camps. And the concentration camps are not the death camps of Germany, but it's a concentration camp in the sense that the only crime that these people committed was being of Japanese descent, and that's what you just call a concentration camp, right? And America went so far in the Supreme Court to basically make a Supreme Court decision against Fred Korematsu, who sued not to go to the camp, that the Supreme Court allowed for the internment of Japanese as a wartime measure to protect America from invasion. Now, here's the thing. Wait, the problem here is we're fighting three countries in this war. America is fighting the Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians, right? And all three groups have large populations of immigrants in America, right? But we're not looking at Germans and Italians and arresting them as a wartime measure to prevent spying. We're only arresting the Japanese. So why did America only target the Japanese? And the answer to this is basically number one, Japan did attack the United States. Because of the invasion or the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a special level of hate for the Japanese and the fact that Americans thought that it was a sneaky attack. Secondly, Japan had a very small population, right? Most of them lived in California as well, too. So it was easy to round up and concentrate this group of people into one camp, right? The German Americans have been coming to America since the beginning of the time. And the Italians are one of the larger new immigrant groups that came to America in huge numbers between 1900 and 1920. So to arrest them, you'd be literally be arresting like 30 or 40% of the nation, which would have been impossible. And there's a healthy dose of racism in there too, because the Japanese are just so they're facial features are different and the language is different, right? It was easy for America to segregate them and single them out as being different. A German American or an Italian American looks very much like what most ordinary classified Americans would be. Now, one difference about this war at the very end of the war is going to be the Nuremberg war crimes trial, right? When this war is over, okay, the leaders of Germany and the Japanese military were executed or jailed for crimes committed in the war instead of the whole country, right? And this is important because at the end of World War One, it was a whole country of Germany that was forced to take blame and pay reparations for World War One, which punished all Germans, even though it's not the people that usually make these decisions, it's political leaders, right? In the past, when the war ended, everyone went home. And the leaders who made those decisions, they faced no punishment and they went home too. Okay. This time there was punishment for the Nazis and the Japanese leaders who committed these crimes. And evaluate this war is the first time this has ever happened where they said, look, we're going to punish you for what you did during the war when the war's over. And were the actions committed by Germany and Japan, did they deserve punishment? And the answer is yeah, they really did. I mean, there was a special level of hate in these two groups of people. And two examples you want to remember is obviously, you can see in the upper left, it's the Holocaust, right? You had 6 million Jews killed, right? You also had 4 million other people killed. They could be Slavics, Russians, homosexuals, gypsies as well too, right? So there's 10 million people arrested, concentrated, and killed, right? In fact, the Germans went so far as to call it the final solution, where the idea was to try to kill all the Jews in Europe. They were successful in killing 90% of all the Jews in Poland, which had the largest population of Jews in the world. And then the camp at Auschwitz killed 2 million people. And the Germans even went so far as to do scientific experiments on live subjects. The Japanese might not have been as organized, but they also were systematic in their killing. You have the rape of Nanking and Shanghai. And basically, what happens here is when after China is invaded, right, 500,000 people were killed basically in an orgy of violence by the Japanese after the fighting was over, right? So Japan had already captured China, and then the Japanese kept killing more Chinese when they didn't need to anymore. You've occupied the land. You've succeeded in your military target. Now they're just going against a group of people because they're different. Now, the end of the war, the Yalta Conference, right? Now, there were several conferences near the end of the war about, okay, when the war is over, what are we going to do in Europe when this war is done? And the most important one is Yalta, because Yalta basically leads to the Cold War, okay? And what happens at Yalta is, the long story short is, Stalin promised free elections in Poland, right? And he lied about that. Stalin is going to turn all of these countries over here, right? This is going to begin the Cold War. He's going to force these countries to become communist, right? And the idea was whatever happened in Poland would happen in the rest of these countries. And Stalin promised to give free elections to Poland. And the idea was, well, if Poland votes, they will definitely vote to become democratic. And then, Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria will follow afterwards, right? Now, what ended up happening is Stalin lied, right? It was a hoax. He was never going to follow through with it. And Could there have been a more successful outcome if FDR and Churchill had been more forceful with Stalin? And actually, no. You know what? This was the best you were going to get, right? One is FDR was old and frail, and he basically got played by Stalin's promises. FDR is going to be dead. He's going to die of old age in about, I think, 2 months after this happens, okay? Also, for Stalin, right, his idea was he already had his troops in these countries here. The only way to get his troops out was to actually go to another war, and America was not ready for that. And Stalin's point of view is the Soviet Union has lost 20 million people. And he's thinking, look, if there's a World War III, it's not going to be fought in the Soviet Union. It's going to be fought here in Eastern Europe. So he wanted a buffer zone in Eastern Europe to prevent another invasion. So for America, the only way to stop Stalin was to use military force. And that's kind of when people are looking back at the real reason why America dropped the atomic bomb to end the war in Japan, right? The answer given at the time was, well, it was to save American lives for an invasion of Japan. Right. And nobody really questioned that at the time, besides the fact that America spent a whole bunch of money on building an atomic bomb. They wanted to take it for a test drive and see if it really worked. But a lot of people say the real reason why America dropped the two bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was it was to scare Stalin, right? We just saw at Yalta the idea that Stalin understands force. And the only way to stop him from expanding was to use force. Well, here we're showing Stalin that we had force. We have an atomic bomb that can destroy a whole city, and we're willing to use it, not just once, but twice. So if Stalin's thinking about expanding more after World War II, he better recognize the fact that we are willing to kill Russians in order to expand it. And what Stalin's looking for is actually self-preservation. All right, guys, thank you very much. That's it for today. So have a good day.